just the general atmosphere, and being a boy has impressed me very, very much.
I remember the Pavilion as being a very exciting place.
It always gave me a thrill, even from a little kid.
There wasn't even any big taverns like there are now. I mean, it was just the Pavilion was the place to go.
I don't think anyone who wasn't there can realize the beauty of it.
It was a marvelous building.
There are an awful lot of people that grew up with the Pavilion. And it was a great place to be.
In April 1909, construction began at what was once a coal yard at the foot of Mason Street in Saugatuck. The Saugatuck Amusement Company intended to build an entertainment pavilion 200 feet long by 105 feet wide, and so grand that people would speak of it with awe far and wide. It would advertise the town more than anything else.
No steel in that. Those were all interwoven, pegged together. They had them on the ground and they slung them all up from the ground position, and they were built like that. Between the bottom of your layers of wood that were bent to your top layer, the X was big enough to stand up.
Although gas lights had been available since 1898, electricity had not yet reached Allegan County. The Big Pavilion even built its own electrical generating plant. It is amazing that this building could be constructed for the summer season. Nonetheless, the gigantic complex structure was ready by opening day. The Big Pavilion Ballroom opened for the 4th of July weekend and was an immediate success. Visitors found it elegant and festive. Those who remember it well tell its story.
And they had little ticket booths all the way around where you'd go in and buy your tickets to dance.
The men had to always pay and pay and pay because after they paid their admission, then they still had to buy dance tickets after they got in, and that was a separate booth, and the prices varied over the years. Probably 10 cents a piece or 7 for 50 cents.
Then there were benches completely encircling the dance floor, and those were usually used by the people who dance.
They didn't have any electric fortification on the sound.
The amplification.
And they have a lot of musicians in the band blowing horns to make it loud enough because the ceiling was so high. They had to have a big band.
Always a wonderful sound. The sound effects in there were marvelous. And it was great music.
Flags were the secret. Flags did something to keep the sound, and there were a lot of them. Well, there was one for every country plus.
And talk about dancing, you were darn lucky to make it one time around the floor, and they got the music. In fact, I would see once in a while where the manager would look at his watch and signal to the orchestra player, and they cut like that. You might be right in the middle of a waltz, and there you stand. I wish my kids and all the kids nowadays would dance like that and have the thrill of the soft music and all the, not none of this disco and the flashing neon lights. Everything was gentle and peaceful, and we just loved it. And so did the girls.
And I must have been about 10 when my dad waltzed me around that glass floor with my feet on his feet. And he wasn't a great dancer. The waltz was mostly it. But you haven't waltzed till you waltzed on the Big Pavilion floor.
And the nicest part, I think, was the nights that we waltzed or we foxtrot. And it was devoted to that kind of dancing.
The Big Pavilion was outlined by thousands of lights on the arches, towers, and some of the windows. The first time the lights were turned on made the Big Pavilion the brightest spot on the Great Lakes.
I just imagine what that must have been in a town that went to bed probably or had oil light, to have seen the night they opened that Big Pavilion. Can you imagine with all those blazing lights? Mm-hmm. It must have just been just beautiful. A thrill. And when the lights would dim and change color according to the tempo of the music, it was a wonderful place to be.
The lights overhead in the big arches changed colors all the time through the dances. My cousin Tom Hedgeland ran the lights for many years. And well, it was just a thrill to be on that beautiful big dance floor and those beautiful lights overhead and the moon sparkling on the water outside.
During the era of wiring the building, I gotta believe there were, let's see, maybe 6, 8 colors, and I know you had a switch for each color, so they all had to be on circuits on that basis, so that when you pushed the red switch, all of the red went on the roofs and around. And of course, it was really beautiful, and especially 4th of July, you red, white, and blued all night long, you know.
By August 1909, a Holland newspaper reported,
Crowds are great. The crowds continue to increase at the Big Pavilion, and special cars bring large numbers from Holland and the Black Lake resorts nearly every evening. Last Wednesday, there were 1,800 paid admissions, and this week, Wednesday, fully as many.
Elmer Weed, one of the original partners, left his family's basket factory in Douglas to run the Big Pavilion. Deke was a nickname for Deacon because of his sober appearance.
Often you could go in there and see him with a plank about 15 or 20 feet long, very, very long, covered with wool or whatever, and he would go all the way around the floor polishing that hardwood floor. Most beautiful floor you've ever seen.
Deke Weed insisted on the patrons' best behavior at all times. Male dancers without suit coats were not welcome, no matter how hot it was. Impeccably dressed, he would patrol the ballroom, making sure others were behaving in a dignified manner.
My recollections of the Big Pavilion go back really to my parents having met here. My mother was 16, my father was 20. This is back in 1913. And he took her dancing to the Big Pavilion. I'm sure a wonderful band there. And the bouncer came out on the floor that evening and said, "Sir, I will have to ask you to leave the floor because your knees are too close to the young ladies." So, and I'm sure they were probably dancing this far apart. And the bouncer probably was Elmer Weed, since he was the very proper person, and he did take very good care that everything was proper.
You know, they didn't have a lot of movies around the country in those days. None of this modern stuff.
In 1913, the pavilion built a sloping platform outside completely open to the weather. When it rained, the film was stopped and customers ran for cover. Movies were hand-cranked as the reel unwound, and they were silent films with captions. During the early years, special events were arranged to attract business. The Farm and Barn Party was the biggest of the season. The orchestra dressed in overalls and straw hats. First prize for the best costume was a pair of pigs.
And like they had a farmer and barn party, they would have corn husks and people in farmers' clothes and everything, and they had certain kind of music and lighting for all of that.
People used to come from various places, mostly from Chicago, across on the boat, and they danced there.
On Saturday night, just as festivities were at their height, the Tennessee would glide alongside the dock and a voice would boom out.
Last bullet for Chicago.
Men would head for the doors, some leaping over the pavilion balcony, leaving their partners in mid-two-step. In 1921, a radio station began broadcasting music from the dance floor. Pennants bearing the call letters of all the stations which received music live from the Big Pavilion were hung from the arches. Pavilion ads coined a new slogan, the brightest spot on the Great Lakes. The movies were brought indoors. 2 electric moving picture machines were installed. The major production for the theater was a showing of A Modern Venus. Ballet dancers and singers from the Chicago Grand Opera supplemented the screen production.
It was a little theater, and as I remember, for children, it was like a dime or 15 cents if you could go to the 6 o'clock movie. The amount could be a little bit off, but I remember for 50 cents we could have a big night on the town.
The theater was pitch dark, you see, and all of a sudden this voice like God talking to you comes out. But I don't think that could have happened in a regular commercial movie theater. It had to be this particular Pavilion Theater.
Being a riverfront town makes Saugatuck a picturesque attraction. It has always been home port to pleasure craft, power, and sail.
You'd walk along what I called the dock. You'd get an ice cream cone, you'd walk along, you'd look at all the boats. The best boats in the harbor would always be tied up at the Pavilion.
And then they started the Venetian night. The Pavilion used to have beautiful Venetian. And they'd string lights all the way around the village, colored lights. And they started that years ago.
I remember standing on the balcony watching they had watermelon races. The boys would jump in and swim after watermelon, and all kinds of things like that going on in the water. And the Venetian night parades were just fantastic because almost every boat was lighted. Didn't have all the modern lights they have today, but they used the Japanese lanterns and candles. And we would stand up on that balcony and watch the parade go by, and it was beautiful.
During the Great Depression, the Pavilion produced theme dances and special events to draw crowds. There was the Big Pavilion Bank of Joy, where cash drawer prizes were awarded, and a pajama party with prizes given to the ladies wearing the, quote, prettiest and least objectionable pajamas, unquote. In 1933, Prohibition ended, and there was a shift in the mood of the nation from ballrooms to barrooms. The Dock Restaurant and Bar was created below the dance floor and alongside the river.
It was paneled and it looked out onto the water. It had little folding windows and lots of them. They had remodeled downstairs, and it was a posh dining room. It was very nice. And they had steaks and chicken and things, and charcoal broiled steaks.
Well, they really didn't have any dress code. They had a cement floor. The only dress code they had, you had to have shoes on. But the rest, they weren't too concerned. Because I'm kind of broken glass. But it was a wild place. But it was nice. You know, I had a lot of fun. And crowded, 3-4 deep at the bar.
Voters that came in, if they knew how to play an instrument, or the jam session guys would get together, and every Saturday and Sunday evening they'd have a jam session down there. And all the guys came from all over, all the bands, and they'd all play down there in the afternoon. And they really had some great times. I mean, it was a fun era.
After the Depression, there was a gradual change from grand ballroom dancing to a preference for swing music. Pre-World War II days were generally good business in resort areas, and a quick succession of bands in the ballroom provided steady crowds.
Anybody could go into the Pavilion. They didn't mind if you behaved yourself if you were a little kid. You couldn't go into the dock unless you were 21, but you could go upstairs to the dances. And I would go there, and of course it was a magic land to a little girl, because here was this fabulous singer. Oh, I used to stand on the edge of the stage and watch the singer, because she would be dressed in something marvelous and long, and the band would play, and then she would sing every now and then she'd go back and sit on her stool. I'm sure it wasn't too exciting for her, but I thought it was fabulous.
They used to have bands that came from New York and California, and big bands on certain weekends.
In Saugatuck, while it was called the Brightest Spot on the Great Lakes,
we had bands that were nationally known.
Well, we had name bands there that we had Wayne King and Art Castle and Danny Russo. Oh, I can name you and knew them all.
I remember standing in front of the pavilion, in between the pavilion and the old Hollyhock House, for probably 6 or 7 hours all day, waiting for Duke Ellington and his band, who had played the night before at Paw Paw, to arrive to play a one-night stand in the pavilion. And they all came off, and that was pre-television days when every one of us didn't have a visual picture of how somebody looked the way they do in today's world. And there we were looking up at him in his fancy zoot suity band clothes and his whole group getting off the bus.
The bands that they got were brought out of Chicago. There were two gentlemen at that time that were almost permanent fixtures here in Saugatuck. Whatever band, because they picked them out of the Union, whatever band came up, they made sure that they were with it. And one of them was Jerry Stalick, who is dead now, and the other one is Bobby Drish, who is still alive and comes up in the summertime. He played piano, and Jerry Stalick played drums. And I first met him with, they played with two bands in Chicago that came up here. They were just stage bands, and then they played with Emil Flint. Well, Emil Flint became the band that came almost every summer for I don't know how many summers. He was the band that came up. And the guys would all get together and play, we'll say, maybe an hour or two at night, and then their friends would come in that played somewhere else, so they always had somebody up on the bandstand playing, and they were good-sized bands.
To extend the season into spring and fall, roller skating was introduced in 1941.
I guess roller skating really predated the dancing at other places before the Big Pavilion was built. Roller skating was kind of an accepted recreation.
Yeah, we used to race. We'd put 4 chairs out and raced around. Yeah, I almost had a medal. Well, I did get a medal, but it was second place. Kid from Callender from Siegel beat me.
Before and even during World War II, the Big Pavilion had some good years.
VJ night. We walked downtown to see what was going on, and this whole back street here where we were sitting, which is Water Street, was solid people, packed with people, waiting in lines. The line up to get in the crowbar, a line up to get into the dock, and a line up to get into the pavilion to dance. I don't know where they all came from, but it seems like everyone in the general vicinity decided, let's go to Saugatuck and celebrate, because it was very exciting. It just people all over.
But after the war, as men began to come back and start families, and they seemed to have a different interest in life, and they didn't go out as much, and they didn't maybe have as much money, and the ballrooms began to kind of slide away.
In the ballroom during the 1950s, the highlight of the season was the Artists' Ball.
I went to several of those crazy balls they had there, like the Artists' Balls, when you'd have to dress up goofy as you could. And one time they just had crazy hat contest. I can remember that. In fact, probably got a picture of it yet. Just anything you could put on a hat, you know, you just fasten it on the best you could, an apple, a pear, or whatever you could, and get, it was just, the crazier you looked, the better.
Dancing in the ballroom was held only on Saturday night. Monday was square dancing, Tuesday was amateur night, Wednesday night was a teen dance, on Thursday Farmer Nick presented wrestling, Friday there was an over 30 dance, and Sunday was reserved for special events.
I remember the wrestling matches in the early 50s, going to them, seeing the probably the early goings-on of the choreographed wrestling matches on television today, where they were hitting each other over the head with the folding chairs.
popularity of television, entertainment tastes changed dramatically. Maintaining and promoting the building had become a greater challenge. However, the owners still intended to open in the spring of 1960. Theater manager Jack Repp had come to Saugatuck to begin getting the theater ready for the new season. On Friday, May 6th, Repp went to the Village Hall to get the water turned on, and he went to the commercial record to discuss the summer advertising plan.
I was apparently downstairs, and I got the message from Mr. Leisure, and he lived across the river. So I knew it had to be on that side, and I turned in the alarm, because at that time we had an alarm system where maybe 4 or 5 places that were open most of the time had some kind of a buzzer that went to the fire station. And I set off the buzzer, and then I took off to see what the situation was. There was just one line of fire all the way up the building.
I think that the siren went off about 5 minutes after 12. I owned the only police car. I parked that at the intersection where the stoplight is now by Village Hall. And smoke was pouring out of what would have been an upstairs part of the theater.
I saw it. Who didn't? Matter of fact, I managed to get down here early enough to see the fire department come. And they went out and down to the south end of it. And she says, "They're back." They just went down and came back. They didn't even try to do anything to it down there because they couldn't. It was coming up faster than they could run.
Well, the fire truck itself, we drove right down to the river, and it was at the south end of the pavilion by the theater. Put 2 lengths of suction hose on it and sucked the water out of the river. But this green duckwood, it was horrible. Pretty soon we'd start losing pressure, and then I'd have to shut it down, and they'd be howling, "Water, water."
But yeah, the air was full of sparks. It was going. I mean, there was timber in the air burning, so it was, and black. It was very, very black. You've seen some of the pictures. That tar on that roof was just causing a black smoke that was unbelievable.
It was so large, we closed the bank, put all the money in the vault, and the bank was closed that afternoon because we could sit in the windows. Of course, the bank was on Butler Street, right on the corner, and we could stand in the window and see the flames over Flint's building. So it was that big a fire, and we were very worried that the whole town was going to go. So,
you know, it was really a big concern. There was many, many fire departments from all over the countryside here in town.
People fought the fire. I know there was probably pretty close to 100 firemen that were at the scene. I know it was awful hot. You know, it was super, super hot. It was that, like I said, we didn't have the protective equipment like we today, or back then like we do today. And so you had to stand behind a tree to even get fairly close.
He was a young doctor in the town at the time, and he ran around with a can of something, and he was plastering it on everybody's face and hands to keep from getting burned. It was really kind of a bad deal. You know, town's lucky to be here.
There was a small restaurant called the Hollyhock House, I believe, that was located across the street from the pavilion. And I always remember that afterwards they had a number of candles that on display there that had been on some shelves inside the Hollyhock House the day that the pavilion burnt down. and had melted down. They had melted right over it into just a pool of wax, and just indicated how the tremendous heat that had been generated by the fire, and how the building didn't catch on fire, I'll never know.
The wind all morning had been blowing out of the southwest, right, Ralph? And shortly after the fire started, it switched around to southeast. And basically, that's what saved the town.
The wind blew the flames and the pieces of wood across the river. Houses were burning on the other side. The fire trucks from every place were there. All the volunteers were on the other side of the river fighting the biggest thing that had happened in Saugatuck history.
I talked to a policeman who was directing traffic at the corner at the drugstore corner. And my recollection, and in fact it's in the movie that my mother took, that there was nothing but basically a wall of fire looking down towards the river from that corner. And I believe the policeman asked me or directed me across the river to see what was happening over there. And then somehow I got involved with some fireman, and I don't recall who it was, but he asked if there were a bunch of kids that could go over, and until all these other various fire agencies started coming into town, everybody I think was pretty well strapped to be fighting this fire. So I got my father's dry cleaning truck. He was a volunteer fireman at the time, and I got the dry cleaning truck, the old Ford panel van, and I loaded up with kids and what they call Indians, which are portable strapped-to-your-back fire extinguishers, water-filled fire extinguishers the fire department had. And I took a bunch of kids and a bunch of Indians, and we went back across the river to start fighting some of the fires that were going in the grass and in the leaves and everything. So I was very pumped up. I was tearing, I guess, is the best description, as was, I'm sure, anybody who, just the aspect of it. I'm glad I was not old enough to be a fireman and get down that street and get to the White House corner and look and see what to me must have looked like the Hindenburg crashing. I mean, my God, what are we going to do with this? I mean, it's not like fighting a fire in a cottage or a grass fire or even a house. This is just astonishing.
Yeah, bad fire. They let school out, and school kids went across the river and fought fires over there. You know, the embers carried over the river. So that was a break, too, having those kids. Yeah, it was a bad one. Sorry that could have gone.
Our family cottage burned the very same day. I remember coming home from high school. I was a freshman. It was a Friday. And my mother and aunt were sitting in the living room looking very, very upset. And I can't remember if my mother or aunt told me that the cottage had burned. The pavilion had burned. It's the same day the Princess Margaret got married. I remember watching that on television.
They were hosing down the building, and our entire fire department was on our roof on that side. And when the side structure fell in, it did fall into us. My main concern at that time was for our fire department, because they were all people I knew. And they all escaped without getting burned. It's an emotional thing for me, because I can't forget that.
Still smoking and still burning. And it was down, you know, in the thing, but the rubble was still there. So, yeah, 3 o'clock in the morning, we're still going with it.
When the fire was finally out, all that was left was a pile of debris. This postcard was sent the day after the fire.
Thought you would like this picture, as you will never see the pavilion again. It burned to the ground Friday, all gone in 45 minutes. What a fire. Those firemen really worked. Departments from many cities came. Saved some other building. Hotel Saugatuck was scorched and glass broken. Hollyhock and Corner Grill the same. a building across river burned down. Embers floated, woods on fire. What a day and night.
I've made this statement and people have just stared at me and shook their head, but I say it again, going back to the years where I had to go up with a fire extinguisher when I was my teenager. Birds would build nests up in those peaks, in those towers. And you'd go up there and there'd be weird things up there. String, cigarette packages, whatever a seagull or whatever type of bird would carry. And to this day, I think a bird carried a lit cigarette or something up in that peak, because I don't see how anything up there could start fire.
It just felt like you were lost, really. It was such a big part of Saugatuck that, you know, you just wondered, gosh, what's going to happen now?
I stood out there and watched it with tears streaming down my face because it took away kind of the heart of Saugatuck and a place that I just had a wonderful time.
Our whole being was in the pavilion in those days, and it just felt very, very empty, and you wondered what could happen in Saugatuck without a pavilion.
I talked to the owners the next night at the Crowbar. We sat and we talked, Mr. Shutter and Mr. Byfield and Mr. Constantine, and I felt that they were going to rebuild. But the question came up at that time, what would the cost be to try to rebuild something like that? And as to rebuild something else, it would never be what that was. So they kicked it around, and at that time they were going to go back to Chicago to their businesses in Chicago and make a decision on what to do, because they didn't figure they could ever build a building like that. And they thought if they put something else there, it is not going to be like that was, so it was not feasible to even think about building that building.
The owner sold the property, and it became, well, pretty much what it is today. Parking lot and boat slips.
Local historian Jim Sheridan wrote,
"No one can say that the presence of the Big Pavilion was anything but positive. It might be given credit for pulling Saugatuck through 2 wars and a depression in which the resort community might otherwise have suffered irreparable economic losses."
As the Big Pavilion lights dim yet another time, and the last strains of the music float over the dance floor, an era has ended that will never fade from our memory.
It was good times, and it was a fun building.
It was the best skating rink around.
It was just incredible. And to have come up through that era was a privilege. It was a wonderful place, and in our hearts it still is.
It was a great spot.
Well, it was a bright spot on the lakes.
It was truly a bright spot.